I followed my wife that night to prove my suspicions wrong. Instead, I watched my marriage end from across a candlelit table. For most of our marriage, I believed I was the kind of man who trusted easily. Maybe too easily. My wife and I had been together for almost 4 years, and until recently, life between us had felt steady. Not perfect, but comfortable in the quiet way long relationships often become. We had our routines: late-night takeout on Fridays, grocery shopping on Sunday mornings, the soft hum of the TV filling the apartment while we both pretended to watch but mostly just enjoyed being near each other. But somewhere in the past few weeks, something had shifted. At first, it was so small I almost ignored it. She started keeping her phone closer than usual. Not in an obvious way, nothing dramatic like hiding it under pillows or locking it with new passwords. Just small things. Turning the screen face down when I walked into the room. Taking quick glances at notifications and replying while angled slightly away from me. Little things. Things that could mean nothing. I told myself I was imagining it. But the distance grew in other ways too. She used to talk to me about her day without me asking, stories about coworkers, complaints about meetings, random details that never seemed important but somehow made the evening feel shared. Lately, though, when I asked how work went, her answers had become short. Busy. Nothing special. Then she would quickly change the subject. It left this strange quiet between us that I couldn't explain. Still, I didn't confront her. I didn't want to be the paranoid husband inventing problems where none existed. Until that Thursday evening. I was sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone when she walked out of the bedroom already dressed to go out. Black blouse. The one she usually saved for nicer dinners. Her hair was done carefully, falling over one shoulder in soft waves. I remember looking up at her and feeling a strange twist in my chest. "You going somewhere nice?" I asked casually. She grabbed her purse from the counter without meeting my eyes. "Just dinner with some coworkers," she said. "Probably won't be too late." There was nothing suspicious about the words themselves. But something about the way she said them felt rehearsed. Too quick. Too smooth. She leaned down and kissed my cheek, light and brief, barely more than a brush of her lips. "I'll text you later," she added. Then she left. The door clicked shut behind her, and the apartment suddenly felt different. Too quiet. For a while, I stayed on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen. Part of me told myself to forget about it. To trust her. To let the night pass like any other. But another part, the quiet, persistent voice in the back of my mind, kept replaying the moment she avoided my eyes. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Finally, I stood up. I grabbed my jacket from the chair by the door and paused with my hand on the handle. This was the moment where I could still turn back. If I left now, there was no going back to pretending everything was normal. I closed my eyes for a second and exhaled slowly. Then I opened the door. Cool night air brushed against my face as I stepped outside. I told myself I was just being careful. Just making sure. But deep down, as I walked toward my car and started the engine, I already had the sinking feeling that whatever I was about to discover was going to change everything. The drive across town felt longer than it should have. I stayed a few cars behind her the entire way, careful not to get too close. Every red light made my chest tighten, every turn forcing me to remind myself not to panic. Part of me kept hoping she would pull into some ordinary place, a crowded bar with coworkers laughing outside, maybe a noisy chain restaurant where people from her office gathered after long days. Something normal. Something that would make me feel ridiculous for following her. But that didn't happen. Instead, she turned onto a quiet street I rarely drove through. The area was older, lined with small buildings and warm yellow streetlights that cast soft pools of light onto the pavement. And then she slowed down. I watched as her car pulled to the curb in front of a small restaurant tucked between two brick storefronts. The place looked intimate, almost hidden. Large windows glowed softly from inside, and through the glass I could see small round tables lit by candles. Not exactly the kind of place people usually went with a group of coworkers. My stomach sank. I parked half a block away and sat there for a moment, my hand still gripping the steering wheel. Maybe they were meeting inside. Maybe I was still overthinking this. I watched her step out of the car. She paused briefly to smooth her hair in the reflection of the window before walking toward the entrance. That small gesture, something about the care she took, made something inside me tighten. Then she went inside. For a few seconds, I just sat there. The quiet hum of my engine filled the car, mixing with the faint sound of traffic from the main road down the street. I told myself I could still leave. I didn't need to walk in there. Whatever was happening inside that restaurant, maybe it was better if I never saw it. But curiosity, or maybe fear, pushed me out of the car anyway. The night air was cool as I walked toward the building. Each step felt heavier than the last, like my body already knew what my mind was trying to avoid. When I reached the door, warm light spilled out from the windows beside it. I hesitated for a moment, staring through the glass. Inside, the restaurant was calm and softly lit. A few couples sat at scattered tables, leaning toward each other in quiet conversation. The gentle sound of jazz music floated through the room, blending with the occasional clink of glasses. It looked peaceful. Almost romantic. I opened the door and stepped inside. Immediately, the smell of garlic, roasted herbs, and fresh bread filled the air. For a second, the warmth of the room made me forget why I had come. Then my eyes began scanning the tables. One by one. My heart started beating faster. Near the back of the restaurant, I finally saw her. My wife sat at a small candlelit table across from a man I had never seen before. They were leaning slightly toward each other, their conversation easy and relaxed. She was smiling. Not the polite smile she used with strangers, but the soft, genuine one I remembered from when we first started dating. The man said something that made her laugh quietly. She reached across the table and lightly touched his hand. That single gesture felt like someone had knocked the air out of my chest. The room suddenly seemed distant, like the sounds around me were fading underwater. I stood there frozen for a moment, watching a life I thought was mine unfold at a table across the room, like I was nothing more than a stranger passing through. And the worst part was, neither of them had noticed me yet. For a moment, I couldn't move. My eyes stayed fixed on that small table near the back of the restaurant, as if looking away would somehow make the scene disappear. But it didn't. My wife was still there, leaning slightly forward, her fingers resting lightly against the stranger's hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. The candle between them flickered softly, casting warm light across their faces. They looked comfortable together, familiar. That was the part that hurt the most. This wasn't awkward or secretive. It looked practiced. I suddenly felt like I didn't belong in that room. My chest tightened as the quiet conversations around me blurred together into a dull hum. The soft jazz music, the clink of glasses, the low laughter from nearby tables, all of it felt strangely distant. I turned slightly, ready to leave. I didn't want to watch anymore. But just as I took a step toward the door, a calm voice spoke gently beside me. "Are you all right?" I froze. When I turned, I found myself facing a woman I hadn't noticed before. She stood a few feet away, watching me with quiet concern. She looked to be in her early 40s, maybe a little older than my wife, though the confidence in the way she carried herself made it hard to guess exactly. Her dark hair was pulled back loosely, a few soft strands framing her face. She wore a simple black dress, the kind that looked elegant without trying too hard. There was something steady about her presence. Grounded. Like someone who had learned how to read people without needing them to say a word. For a second, I struggled to answer. Yeah, I said, though the words sounded weak even to me. Her eyes shifted briefly past me, toward the dining room behind. It was a subtle glance. But I had the uncomfortable feeling she had already noticed exactly what I had been staring at. When her gaze returned to me, her expression softened slightly. "Would you like to sit down for a moment?" she asked gently. Her voice wasn't intrusive. It didn't carry pity either. Just quiet understanding. I hesitated. Embarrassment washed over me, hot and sudden. The last thing I wanted was for a stranger to witness whatever humiliation I was currently standing in. "I'm fine," I muttered. But my voice cracked just enough to betray me. She didn't call attention to it. Instead, she simply gestured toward a small corner table near the front of the restaurant, far enough away that I wouldn't be facing the back. "You look like someone who's been standing in the cold too long," she said with a faint, reassuring smile. "At least let me bring you some water." The strange thing was, I didn't feel pressured. If anything, the calmness in her voice made it easier to breathe. I glanced once more across the room. My wife was still laughing at something the man said. Completely unaware of me standing there. That was enough. I nodded slowly. The woman guided me to the corner table, pulling out the chair slightly before stepping away toward the bar. When she returned a moment later, she placed a glass of water in front of me. As she slid it across the table, her fingers brushed lightly against mine for just a second. The contact was brief. But it was warm. Comforting, in a strange way I hadn't expected. "Take your time," she said softly. Then she remained there for a moment, resting her hand lightly against the back of the empty chair across from me. Not hovering. Just present. And somehow, in the middle of the worst moment of my marriage, that quiet presence made the room feel a little less overwhelming. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. I sat there staring down at the glass of water in front of me, watching the faint ripples settle from when she had placed it on the table. My hands rested loosely around it, more for something to hold on to than because I was thirsty. Across from me, the woman remained standing for a second before finally taking the empty chair. She moved with an easy confidence, the kind that made it clear this place belonged to her. Up close, I noticed details I hadn't before. Faint lines at the corners of her eyes that deepened slightly when she smiled. The subtle scent of jasmine from her perfume when she leaned forward just enough to rest her forearms lightly on the table. Not overwhelming. Just warm. Comforting. "I'm Elena," she said after a moment, her voice calm and low enough not to carry beyond our table. I hesitated before answering. "Daniel." She nodded slightly, like she was filing the name away somewhere. For a moment, her gaze drifted toward the back of the restaurant, not directly, just enough to acknowledge the direction I had been looking earlier. Then her eyes returned to me. "You don't have to explain anything," she said gently. Something about the way she said it, matter of fact, not dramatic, made the tight knot in my chest loosen just a little. I let out a quiet breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "You noticed?" I asked. Her lips curved in a small, sympathetic smile. "I've been running this place for 12 years, she replied. "You learned to read a room." Her tone wasn't judgmental. If anything, it carried the quiet patience of someone who had seen people at their best and worst and understood that life could be messy. I glanced down at the table again, feeling a familiar wave of embarrassment creeping in. "I didn't plan on making a scene," I said quietly. I actually wasn't even sure what I was doing when I walked in. Elena leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture relaxed. "Most people don't," she said. There was a brief pause between us, filled with the soft murmur of the restaurant around us. The jazz music still played faintly in the background, and somewhere near the kitchen a glass clinked softly against another. I risked a glance toward the back again. My wife was still there. Still smiling. Still completely unaware of the quiet conversation happening across the room. When I looked back at Elena, she was watching me, not intensely, just attentively. The kind of listening that made you feel like your thoughts weren't being rushed. "Does it ever get easier?" I asked before I could stop myself. The question slipped out quietly, almost like I had asked it more to the table than to her. For a moment, she didn't answer. Instead, she reached across the table and gently nudged the glass of water a little closer to me. Her fingers brushed mine again, light, brief, but deliberate enough to feel reassuring. Not at first, she admitted softly. Something about the way she said it made me look up. There was understanding in her eyes. But also something deeper. Experience. You sound like you've been here before, I said. Elena's smile faded just slightly, replaced by a thoughtful expression. Oh, she said with a quiet exhale, more than once. The words weren't bitter. If anything, they carried the calm acceptance of someone who had already walked through their own storms and come out the other side. For the first time since walking into the restaurant, I felt my shoulders relax. Because suddenly, I wasn't just the guy who had followed his wife into a terrible moment. I was simply a person sitting across from someone who understood. I don't know how long I sat there with Elena. 5 minutes. Maybe 10. Time inside that restaurant had started to feel strangely suspended, like the rest of the world was moving somewhere outside the warm glow of those candlelit tables. Eventually, though, my eyes drifted back toward the back of the room again. My wife was still sitting there. Still leaning toward the man across from her. Still smiling in a way that felt painfully familiar. For a moment, I just watched them in silence. Then something inside me settled. Not anger. Not even heartbreak. Just a quiet clarity. I should probably go over there, I said softly. Elena didn't react with surprise. If anything, she had been expecting those words. She gave a small nod, her gaze steady. Only if you're ready. I stood up slowly from the chair. My legs felt a little stiff, like I had been sitting there for hours instead of minutes. For a second, I hesitated. Then Elena reached out and lightly touched my forearm. The gesture was simple, but grounding. Whatever happens, she said quietly, try to keep your dignity. That's the one thing no one can take from you. I looked at her and gave a small, grateful nod. Then I turned and walked toward the back of the restaurant. Each step felt strangely calm. The closer I got, the clearer their voices became. They were laughing about something, some small story that seemed entirely ordinary to them. My wife noticed me first. Her smile disappeared instantly. For a moment, she just stared at me like she wasn't sure if I was real. Daniel, she said. The man across from her turned, confusion written across his face. I stopped beside their table. Up close, the scene felt even more surreal. The candle between them flickered quietly, illuminating the half-finished glasses of wine and the plates of food that neither of them had touched in a while. I was wondering where you were having dinner, I said. My voice sounded calmer than I expected. Almost detached. My wife opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. This isn't what it looks like, she finally said weakly. The line was so predictable it almost made me laugh. I looked down at the table, at the way her hand had been resting near his just moments before. Then I looked back at her. You don't have to explain, I said quietly. The man shifted awkwardly in his chair. I think I should, he started. You probably should, I agreed, glancing at him briefly. He stood up quickly, muttered something under his breath, and stepped away from the table, disappearing toward the front of the restaurant. That left just the two of us. My wife looked smaller somehow now. Less confident than she had only minutes earlier. I was going to tell you, she said. I nodded slowly. Maybe. There was a long silence between us. Finally, I stepped back from the table. I hope you enjoy the rest of your dinner, I said calmly. Then I turned and walked toward the door. The cool night air hit my face the moment I stepped outside. For the first time that night, my chest felt heavy again. Not because I had confronted her, but because it was over. A few minutes later, the restaurant door opened behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Elena stepped outside and gently placed a hand on my shoulder. And somehow, that small, steady touch kept the entire night from completely breaking me. The night air felt colder now. Not the sharp kind of cold that stung your skin, but the quiet kind that seemed to settle into your chest. I stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, staring down the empty street as cars passed occasionally in the distance. Behind me, the door opened softly. I didn't turn around. A moment later, I felt it, a gentle hand resting on my shoulder. Warm. Steady. You handled that better than most people would, Elena said quietly. Her voice carried the same calm tone she had used inside, but now it felt even softer in the quiet of the street. I let out a breath that felt heavier than it should have. I'm not sure I handled it at all, I admitted. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Her hand remained on my shoulder, not gripping, not pushing, just there. A simple presence that made the silence feel less lonely. Finally, she stepped beside me. Up close, the street light above us cast a soft glow along the edge of her hair, highlighting the gentle lines of her face. She looked thoughtful, like someone remembering something from long ago. You know, she said after a moment, this isn't the first time I've walked someone outside after a night like this. I glanced at her. You mean customers? She gave a small, knowing smile. Sometimes, she said. Then she folded her arms loosely, leaning back slightly against the brick wall beside the restaurant. But the first time it happened to me, she added, her voice quieter now. That caught my attention. I looked at her more carefully. You? I asked. She nodded slowly. Years ago, she said. My ex-husband used to meet someone here too. Not in this building, this place didn't belong to me yet, but on this same street. Her eyes drifted down the road as if she could still see that version of her life standing there. I remember standing exactly where you are right now, she continued. Feeling like the ground had just shifted underneath me. There wasn't bitterness in her voice. Just memory. After a moment, she pushed herself off the wall and looked back at me. Come inside, she said gently. We're closing soon anyway. I hesitated. I don't want to keep you from your work. She smiled faintly. The kitchen's already cleaning up. Besides, she added, I think tonight calls for tea more than fresh air. Something about the simple invitation felt impossible to refuse. A few minutes later, we were sitting at the quiet bar inside the restaurant. Most of the lights had been dimmed now. Chairs were stacked neatly on several tables, and the soft jazz music had been replaced by the distant sounds of the kitchen finishing up. Elena placed 2 mugs of tea on the counter and slid one toward me. Careful, she said. It's hot. Our fingers brushed again as I took it. This time the contact lingered just slightly longer. Not awkward. Just natural. For a while, we sat there in comfortable silence, sipping the tea. Eventually, I spoke. I don't even know what I'm supposed to feel right now. Elena rested her chin lightly against her hand as she watched me. That's normal, she said softly. Then, without hesitation, she reached over and gently squeezed my hand once. Sometimes, she added, the first step isn't figuring out what you feel. It's realizing you're not alone while you figure it out. And sitting there in the quiet glow of that nearly empty restaurant. I believed her. Life didn't magically fix itself after that night. There was paperwork. Long conversations that felt more like formalities than emotional closures. The slow, uncomfortable process of untangling a life that had once been shared. My wife moved out 2 weeks later. The apartment felt different without her things scattered around, the small routines we had built together suddenly gone. At first, the silence bothered me. But over time, I started realizing something strange. The silence wasn't painful. It was peaceful. And every now and then, without really planning it, my thoughts would drift back to that restaurant. Back to the warm lighting. Back to the quiet woman who had sat across from me when my world had cracked open. For a while, I told myself there was no reason to go back. Elena had simply been kind to a stranger on a bad night. That was all. But one evening, about 3 weeks later, I found myself driving through that same part of town again. I hadn't planned it. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. The street looked exactly the same as it had that night. The same row of brick buildings, the same soft glow of streetlights stretching along the pavement. And there it was. The restaurant windows glowing warmly in the evening dark. My hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. For a moment, I considered driving past. But instead, I pulled over and parked. The familiar sound of the doorbell chimed softly when I stepped inside. The restaurant looked calm as always, soft music playing, candles flickering gently on each table. And then I saw her. Elena stood behind the bar speaking with one of the servers. When she looked up and noticed me, there was a brief flicker of surprise in her eyes. Then she smiled. Not the polite smile someone gives a customer. A real one. "Well," she said as I approached, "that's a face I didn't expect to see again so soon." I rubbed the back of my neck awkwardly. "I hope that's not a bad thing." Her smile widened slightly. "Not at all." She stepped around the bar and gestured toward a small corner table, the same one where I had sat that first night. "I was just about to take a break," she said. "Care to join me?" A few minutes later, we were sitting across from each other again. But everything felt different this time. The weight that had hung over that first conversation was gone. Now there was something lighter between us. Curiosity. Comfort. At one point during the conversation, she laughed softly at something I said and reached across the table, brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. For a brief moment, our hands rested near each other on the table. Neither of us moved them away. Eventually, when it was time for me to leave, we stood near the door together. "Thank you," I said. "For what?" she asked. "For that night," I replied. "You didn't have to sit with me like that." She studied me for a second before stepping a little closer. Then she wrapped her arms gently around me. The hug was warm. Unhurried. Her cheek brushed lightly against my shoulder, and for a moment neither of us pulled away. When she finally stepped back, her smile was softer now. "You're always welcome here," she said. As I stepped back out into the cool night air, something felt different. 3 weeks earlier, I had walked into that restaurant and watched my life fall apart. But somehow, by walking back through those doors again tonight, it felt like something new had quietly begun.